I didn't notice when my family started feeling different. I only noticed when I began walking through the house in the evenings and realizing I wasn't sure what everyone else was doing anymore. It wasn't that anything had gone wrong. It was just that something had quietly changed. There was a time when I always knew where everyone was. Not in a controlling way. Just in the natural way families move around each other when they share the same routines. I knew who would be in the kitchen around 5. I knew who would leave their shoes near the door. I knew who would come in late and turn on the hallway light without thinking about it. Back then, the house had a rhythm that didn't need explaining. Even after the children grew older and began building lives of their own, that rhythm stayed with us longer than I expected. They didn't live here anymore, but they moved through this house as if they still understood it from the inside. They knew which cabinet held the good mugs. They knew where the extra blankets were. They knew how the back door stuck a little in the winter and needed a small push with your shoulder. It felt like nothing important had changed. They still came by without calling sometimes. They still stayed long enough for coffee to turn into dinner without anyone deciding it would. They still talked about ordinary things while standing in the kitchen like they had always done. And I believed that was simply how things would continue. Looking back now, I think the first sign was not something I saw. It was something I stopped hearing. There used to be small conversations happening all the time. Not serious ones. Just the kind that fill space without anyone noticing. Someone asking where the scissors were. Someone saying they would be back later. Someone opening the refrigerator and calling out to see if anyone else wanted something. At some point those sounds became less frequent. Not suddenly. Not in a way that made me stop and think about it right away. They just became quieter. I remember one evening when I came into the kitchen expecting to hear someone already there. I don't even know why I expected it. Habit, maybe? I stood there for a moment before realizing the house was completely still. That wasn't unusual. But it felt unusual. Later that night I realized what I had been waiting for without knowing it. I had been expecting the house to sound the way it used to sound. Even when everyone began living separately, there were still evenings when the house felt full. Someone would stop by after work. Someone else would come in on the weekend. Sometimes they came together without planning it. Sometimes they came one at a time, but often enough that the space between visits never felt long. It was a noise that made the house feel alive. It was movement. The sense that someone might come through the door at any moment. I didn't notice when that feeling started to fade. At first, I told myself it was normal. Families change. People grow older. Schedules become complicated. There are jobs and errands and responsibilities that didn't exist when everyone was younger. I understood all of that. Still, something about the visits began to feel different. Not less kind. Not less warm. Just more planned. Someone would say they could stop by for a little while. Someone would check the time before sitting down. Someone would mention what they needed to do afterward. Those things made sense. But they also changed the shape of the time we spent together. There used to be evenings when no one asked how long they would stay. Now there were evenings when everyone seemed to know exactly how long they had. One afternoon I found myself setting out more cups than I needed before anyone arrived. I did it without thinking, the same way I always had. Then I stopped and put one back in the cabinet. I wasn't even sure why I had done that. Later I realized I had already begun expecting fewer people at the table. That surprised me more than I expected. It wasn't disappointment. It was recognition. Recognition that I had quietly adjusted my expectations without noticing when that adjustment began. There is a hallway in this house with photographs on one side. They have been there for years. Some of them are from when the children were very young. Some from later, when they were already taller than I was willing to admit at the time. I walk past those photographs every day. But one evening I stopped longer than usual in front of one of them. It was a picture taken in the kitchen many years ago. Everyone was standing too close together because the room wasn't large enough for the number of people in it. Someone was laughing at something outside the frame. Someone else was holding a plate they never finished eating from. No one was looking directly at the camera. It didn't look like a special moment. It looked like an ordinary one. And somehow that made it feel more important. I stood there longer than I meant to. Not because I was sad. Just because I was trying to understand why that picture felt closer than the house around me did at that moment. That was when I began to realize the difference I had been feeling wasn't about distance. It was about timing. There was a time when everyone's schedules overlapped naturally. Now they touched each other only occasionally. And when schedules change, families change in ways that are difficult to describe. The visits continued. The conversations continued. The phone calls continued. Nothing disappeared. But something shifted. One evening they came over together without much notice. That used to happen often. I made coffee without asking if anyone wanted it. Someone sat at the table. Someone else walked into the living room and turned on the television without really watching it. For a while everything felt the same again. We talked about ordinary things. Someone mentioned work. Someone mentioned traffic. Someone asked about the neighbor's garden. The conversation moved easily, the way it always had. Then one of them looked at the clock. "We can't stay too long tonight," they said. It was said gently. Naturally. Without hesitation. But I realized something in that moment. It wasn't the first time I had heard those words. It was the first time I understood what they meant. They didn't mean anything was wrong. They meant life had moved forward. After they left that evening, I stayed in the kitchen longer than I usually do. The cups were still on the table. One chair was slightly pulled back. The room looked exactly the same as it always had after a visit. But the feeling was different. Not empty. Just quieter. I began noticing small things after that. The way visits started later in the day. The way they ended earlier than they used to. The way conversations stayed closer to practical topics than they once had. None of those things felt serious on their own. Together they began to feel like something I needed to understand. The moment everything became clear came on a Sunday afternoon. They had come by for coffee. We sat together at the kitchen table like always. Someone told a story about something that had happened earlier in the week. Someone else laughed in the same way they always had. For a little while, the room felt exactly the way it used to. Then someone said they needed to leave soon. Another agreed. Someone else mentioned something they had to finish before evening. Chairs moved. Jackets were picked up. The conversation continued while everyone stood instead of sitting. And suddenly the visit was over. I walked them to the door the way I always do. We stood there for a moment before they left. Someone said they would call later in the week. Someone else said they would come again soon. I believed them. Because I knew they meant it. But after the door closed, I stood in the hallway for a few seconds longer than usual. That was the moment I understood what had been changing all along. My family hadn't become distant. They had become busy in ways that didn't leave as much room for ordinary time together. And ordinary time had always been the thing that made this house feel like the center of everything. For a long time I thought closeness meant being together often. Now I think it means something else. It means knowing they still come through the same door. It means knowing they still sit in the same chairs. It means knowing that when they do visit, even if it's only for a short while, they are still part of this house in ways that don't depend on how long they stay. My family feels different now. Not smaller. Not farther away. Just shaped by lives that continue beyond these walls. And maybe growing older means learning that family doesn't stop being close when time becomes limited. Sometimes it simply becomes quieter in a way that takes longer to understand.